Okay, so last time that we were together, we talked about transportation and we had mentioned things like turnpike trusts and John McAdam and how he in, improved roads and Richard Trevithick with the first steam powered locomotive. And so we need to move on here. We need to talk about George Stephenson and how he took the ideas of Trevithick and he improved it, made it much stronger. So he built a locomotive that could pull a train of cars, and it was much more powerful than the previous ones that have been built. And so it made it a lot more useful. And then we also have Robert Fulton, who developed the idea for a steamboat. Of course, that's going to be important for transportation on the waterways. And we've all heard of the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur. They're the first in flight, and they helped to improve transportation during this age of industrialism. And then finally, here we have Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford did not invent the car, but he did invent the idea of the assembly line, or maybe he didn't invent it, but he was the one who put it into practice and made it efficient in building his Model T cars. And that is one of the things that helped to continue to develop industrialization through a better manufacturing method. And we use the idea of mass production that builds off of Henry Ford's ideas. Essentially, they could take one product and they could have multiple workers doing a specific part of that product. And so rather than one worker for the next week focus on building one car, he now focuses on one aspect of that car. Maybe he is assembling the wheels and putting those on, or perhaps he's putting doors on. And that's all he does all day long. He sits there and he puts on door after door after door. That's part of the idea of Henry Ford that allowed him to train his workers much more quickly and also allowed him to produce cars much more efficiently. And so that led to this idea of mass production. And so we see this in the form of automation, where machines could now begin to replace the work of men. You no longer had to have a machine that could build the entire car. You could have a machine that could just put on one aspect of that car. Now, it's still going to be a ways down the road, but in other factories, there were machines that were beginning to replace men on the working floor. And the men, then, their role is to oversee the working parts of these machines. So you don't need nearly as many manual laborers. You now need people that understand the workings of these machines and can fix them when they break down. And there was a massive change in the way that workers were trained and the way and the type of workers that were needed. You now needed more educated workers to work these factories, or people that could be trained much more in depth than just a simple manual laborer like you might have needed before. But you need fewer people. And one of the reasons why this was so successful was because of the concept of interchangeable parts. Parts are consistent, and so you no longer have to replace the entire machine. You can simply replace a broken part. And so let's go back to the illustration of the vehicle. If your wheel breaks off, you don't have to go buy a brand new car, you just go buy a new wheel, and you can put it on yourself or hire somebody to do that for you. Whereas in the past, not all of the parts were exactly the same because you had individual people who were making each of those parts. And so it was not a one size fits all type of replacement, and it became very costly to customize a new wheel for your vehicle or whatever part had broken down. Now, I'm oversimplifying it there. A wheel you could probably make on your own, but some of these parts that went inside of these very intricate machines were not interchangeable prior to the Industrial Revolution. This also led to division of labor because of mass production. Now we no longer had to work from start to finish on a product, but we now could have a specialized job within that production process. I mentioned Henry Ford's assembly line, and that's really what this is all about. You could train one person on one job, and that's all he has to know. He has no idea how to assemble that entire car, but he could put together one piece of that car, and he could do it very well. And that is part of what creates the assembly line. And they're assembling a specific part of the product and are going to be able to do that very efficiently and do that very well in order to produce the maximum number of cars at the lowest cost. Now we're going to skip over that video here for the moment, and we're going to go into some science and industry that was happening during this time as well. Of course, we're all familiar with Thomas Edison. He provided a number of new products to help both industry and society, most notably his incandescent light bulb that ran off electricity and was instant light. And it transformed the way that industry worked because now you could turn the lights on and workers could continue working later into the evening, and it was very cost efficient as well. Um, that is, once you had all the wiring in there, that was not cheap. But Thomas Edison was the most famous of all those, and he's the one we're going to attribute to the majority of the work there for right now. As far as business finance goes, a lot of large corporations begin to replace smaller businesses instead of having some unique and individualized small businesses. You're going to have them absorbed into the larger corporations. Some of the corporations are going to buy out the smaller ones. Some of them are just going to push the smaller ones out of the market. And that also is going to be seen in banks because banks become very important to finance. You have to have a good relationship with a bank and you have to work alongside of a bank in order to build that partnership into getting the finances that you need to run your corporation and run your industry. So there are some consequences that come along with this. While it does seem like life is getting better, and for the owners of these businesses, they are able to work more effectively and they're able to provide products even cheaper. When you look at the working class, the living conditions were very poor. Unfortunately, for many of them, the cities could not keep up with the growth of new people that were flocking to the cities looking for jobs in these factories. So, therefore, it led to a lot of dangerous and unsanitary conditions, not only in the home, but also in the workplace. Many of the employers were not very good at keeping safe conditions for their employees, and unfortunately, they really didn't care. And it was not until the government steps in the mid or early 1900s that you're going to start to see now laws that are going to protect the everyday worker. Oftentimes, if you sustain an injury at work, you were not paid, you were let go, and you were relieved of your responsibilities at work. And that meant that they were going to hire somebody new and they were not going to give you your job back because with you out of the workplace, it meant that that was money lost for the business and they just couldn't afford to do that. And so they would let you go, hire somebody new, and you'd have to find something new. We do have a higher standard of living, and so because of that, it meant that there was better food and better nourishment for people. So the population did increase during the Industrial Revolution. While living conditions were not always great, those that did have jobs and those that were able to work their way up the social class were able to improve their standing in life. And we were also able to produce better quality food and provide it more widespread, even within those cities. And so we were able to advance there in society. There is a great opportunity here for materialism and greed that does creep into society as well. As people are making more money, they are wanting to spend it on things for themselves. And unfortunately, there is a widening gap between the upper class and the working class. And there's not a ton of compassion that we see between the two. And so we see slums develop and we see poor sections of town just continue to get poorer, and the wealthiest section of town just continue to get more and more wealthy. And so, as we evaluate here industrialism as a whole, and I mentioned a little bit of this already here, but the ideas of capitalism and free enterprise lead to that bigger division between the rich and the poor. That those that are able to make the money have the opportunity to do so, but those that are at the lower end really struggle to make their way in society, and it creates a greater division. And this wealth and materialism often leads to more greed. Rather than caring about your fellow man and caring about the lower class worker, it was a survival of the fittest. Those that were able to make the money often did, and they did not share the wealth quite as much. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the responses here a little bit later, but it really is a sad chapter of human life when they failed to recognize those around them and failed to extend that compassion toward them. And so There's a number of things. Those of you going into U.S. history next year, we'll get into this a little bit more in the early 1900s as far as how it affected Americans and led to a lot of reform in the government, especially in the United States. And then we're going to see in the 1920s where it helps out the working class and life is good, eventually leading up to the Great Depression, stock market crash, the Great Depression in the late 1920s and early 1930s.